Hello and welcome to On Geopolitics, this podcast from the Centre for Geopolitics at the University of Cambridge with Professor Ali Ansari and me, Suzanne Raine. Ali, I think, was hoping to have a week not talking about Iran, but I'm not letting him do that because every week at the moment something's happening, which means that we need to talk about Iran again. So on the 19th of May, on a foggy morning, Sunday, we got the breaking news that a convoy of helicopters, one of which was carrying President Raisi of Iran, had gone missing in the mountains on the Iran-Azerbaijan border near Jolfa on the way back to Tabriz, where the president had been opening a dam with his Azeri counterpart. This kind of shocking evidence that all men are mortal, including leaders of countries or presidents of countries, sort of reverberated for a few days. And then there was a lot of debate saying, what does this mean? What does this mean? And a number of seasoned Iran watchers said, well, not terribly much.
Including me.
I thought, Ali, we should discuss not only what it means, because we're now several weeks after the events, but what's happening as a consequence of it, which is perhaps the more important element of this discussion. So over to you.
Well, yes, it's interesting. Iran is the gift that never stops giving, does it? So we seem to be continually talking about crises there. It's been an interesting few weeks, obviously, since the sudden death of Ibrahim Raisi, the president of the Islamic Republic, along with a number of colleagues, three other senior officials, including the foreign minister. And in that time, we've witnessed a funeral, which was relatively well attended. And I think the regime will take a certain amount of encouragement from that, although not as massive as some of the people were claiming, and certainly some of the regime who got a bit carried away. And after that, I think one of the most striking things that's emerged is the way they're trying to sanctify the person of Ibrahim Raisi prior to the new election for president. So there's been a number of different developments, and we can talk, obviously, I know you want to talk about the election and how that will be organized. But I think one of the striking things has been the way in which they're trying to turn Raisi, reshape his image, really on a par with what they did with Soleimani, although Soleimani probably had a better track record of accomplishment, it must be said, than Raisi. They've tried to sanctify him in a way that I think has certainly raised a few eyebrows among the many, what I would say, non-believers in Iran, but even perhaps some of the more cynical elements. So that's been quite interesting, the level of superstition that's really been on show. And the way they've tried to present Raisi as one of the most productive presidents ever to have occupied the role since 1979. Flatly contradicted, actually, I have to say, by his track record.
But he was president for 1,000 days.
Yes, basically he was president from, 2021, I think. And he essentially was widely mocked, I have to say, or criticized, even by his own side, for being woeful at the task. Not a very good manager. He'd obviously been raised through the ranks by Ayatollah Khamenei, as a protege, and was widely touted as a possible successor to Khamenei. I have never thought that, as I've said previously, but nonetheless, he was being pushed and groomed, certainly for a particular role. But in the eyes of many, really promoted beyond his capabilities. So he then becomes president. He's not, particularly competent or productive. He carries with him this enormous baggage of having been part of the Death Committee in 1988, which was a ad hoc judicial committee when he was in the judiciary, set up to oversee the extrajudicial murder of 4,000 political prisoners. And what's important to understand is just how shocking this whole event has been in the history of the Islamic Republic. It's one of the great scandals in modern Iran. And a number of senior ayatollahs, in fact, Khomeini's original successor, Ayatollah Montazeri, was effectively dismissed over his protests about what had happened back in 1988. So it's something that is a very sort of large gaping wound, I have to say, in the Islamic Republic and its moral pretensions, if I can put it that way, because people say, what you've done would embarrass the Shah. It looks bad even compared to what the Shah might or might not have done. But Raisi has been very forthright about it. Raisi basically, when he was challenged on it, unlike other members of the Death Committee, Raisi would say, well, I'm the man for the tough decisions. So for me, Raisi is the exemplar in an Iranian context of the banality of evil. I'm sorry to say that, but I think he's someone who's a functionary, a technocrat. He does the dirty jobs and he takes pride in it. And he thinks he's sort of retained a sort of a dignity in the task. Other members of the Death Committee have not been so proud of their actions. But nonetheless, it is that context which makes this sort of extraordinary contradiction between what people think Raisi is about and how the regime is trying to present him, really as this saintly figure who cared about the people and is in touch with the Almighty and had been in touch with the Almighty. I mean, obviously he's, a bit closer to the Almighty than he might like to have been, but nonetheless.
So, Ali, can I just, because you said something about they were treating him as a saint or sanctifying him. And then you also said, and a whole load of superstition surrounding him. And those two things aren't the same, although I suspect that they are closer to being the same in Iran than they might be in Britain. Well, what did you tell us what you meant? Because I know you've been fascinated watching the process of the funeral.
I've been watching some of the things. So what they've done, and it has caused a certain amount of shock and derision among obviously other aspects of Iranian society who really can't believe what's going on. But what they've done is they've basically, so a cleric, for instance, has come up and given an interview very boldly and said very clearly that Raisi had been in communion with the first Shia Imam Ali, who actually spoke to him. And this was, very routine.
Before the hard landing.
Oh, yes, before that. I mean, this is not even while he was in the helicopter. I mean, but he obviously was in communion with the first Shia Imam. But then when you look at the funeral, there are people wanting to obviously touch the coffin. There's a video of someone bringing a baby to bring the baby to touch the coffin as if somehow it's going to pass on some sort of blessing. It's like a medieval saint. They're trying to benefit from any sort of physical proximity with this figure. And the interesting thing is, of course, is that, for many of the political elite who are considering running in the forthcoming presidential election, what they've basically done is they set up this absurd situation as a test of loyalty for them. You see, if you want to run in this election, you have to acknowledge that Raisi was a saint. And, if you don't, you'll be vetted out effectively. I mean, you won't be allowed to run. But for many people who, 4 or 5 weeks ago were saying how useless he was, they're now having to say, well, no, he was absolutely marvelous and a man of the people who was basically blessed by God. So it's really quite extraordinary. And one of the things for me that I find most shocking in a way, really, to be honest, as someone who studies the development of the state and other things in the Middle East, what you're seeing really in Iran is it's not that superstition exists. I mean, I think as we would agree, superstition exists everywhere, right? It's that the state positively encourages it as an aspect of state policy. It's important for it that the people remain really enthralled, or certainly its supporters remain enthralled to this sort of type of, what even orthodox clerics in Iran would consider superstitious mumbo jumbo.
Which I think it's fascinating because there are obviously echoes with stuff that we've talked about before about how Islamic State created the idea of the prophecies, that cultural, religious aspect of belonging and statehood and the way that it's used to encourage and direct people, in a way, encourage and direct your supporters to a certain kind of action is not unique to Iran. And it's fascinating wherever it happens, actually, in different manifestations. I think it's clearly an important element of contemporary politics, and we don't often treat it as such.
The sad thing is, I think, for many people in Iran who watch this, and particularly those who come from the much more, what we might term Republican background or reformist background that basically directed Iran from the end of the Iran-Iraq war through to 2005, prior to Ahmadinejad taking over, as they look at this sort of stuff with a degree of horror, that these are the sort of people who are in the governing elite of the country. And this view that the government is being run by people who place superstition at the forefront of a lot of their decisions, who are taking decisions based on astrology, for instance. I mean, this sort of thing is absurd. And if you then think about why the country is in the economic state it's in, it then becomes explicable. It's not that people think they're doing the wrong thing. They actually think they're doing the right thing. But those economists who are sitting there saying, if you're looking at the metrics and you're looking at what's going on, we are driving this economy over a cliff. I mean, it's as simple as that. We are not investing in it. We are simply taking stuff out. We're neither investing in economic infrastructure, political or moral infrastructure. And as a result, we're starting to bankrupt the country from within. And that, I think, is the fundamental issue about whether we consider the state as brittle or not brittle or fragile or not, or strong and so, whatever people want to talk about, is if you look at the way in which the state functions and what drives it, these are things that are in many ways alien from what we would consider to be the standard way in which you could run a state. Now, you can differ on economic policy and this, that, the other. That's fine. But fundamentally, there's something going on here which is completely at odds with what people would be considered the normal running of an economy. They're simply not bringing in the sort of investment that's required. And this is why the country's suffering. And if you see, one of the circularities of that, of course, is that the more people despair, the more ignorance there is, and the more people despair, the more they seek out, that savior who's going to come and save, that charismatic figure. And it's a depressing cycle, I have to say. It's a very depressing cycle. But was it someone who said, pity the nation that needs heroes?
So let's raise this up to a bureaucratic level and discuss the process of the election, because I'm interested in that. And I think the reason I'm interested in understanding it is because we think Parliament, President, Supreme Leader kind of parallel with how European or America is structured. Therefore, we can sort of understand it. But it's not quite like that in Iran. And I want you to help explain it. So what's happening? It's been announced today, we're going to say on the 30th of May, that presidential hopefuls have 5 days to register. So that's the time. And state media has reported that already 30 people have come forward to submit applications for candidacy, but none have met the conditions for qualification.
Okay, I wonder,
And meeting that, so then, Ali, the bit that I want you to talk through more. So it seems to me that you have a number of critical bodies who are neither a president nor the Majlis or Parliament, but nonetheless fundamental to the running of the state. And the first is the Guardian Council. And the Guardian Council, as I understand it, has 12 members and has considerable power and influence because it has 3 main responsibilities. One is veto power over legislation passed by the Parliament or Majlis.
Yeah.
The second is the supervision of elections, whichever ones they might be. And the third is approving or disqualifying candidates seeking to run in parliamentary, presidential, or assembly of experts. So the process of choosing who's going to stand goes through this Council of Guardians or Guardian Council.
So the fundamental thing you have to understand is there are no political parties in Iran. Okay, so recognize the fact that there is no means of basically trying to sort of filter out people that you might get in other sort of Western democracies in terms of the hierarchy of the party. So, their rule is we don't have political parties. Everyone must be there for the interests of the revolution and the state. Fine. But the way in which they then filter through is these bodies that will then vet. The Guardian Council is 12 lawyers, 6 are lay, 6 are religious. 6 are appointed by Parliament and 6 are appointed by the Supreme Leader. Okay?
And the ones appointed by Parliament are nominated by the Chief Justice, who is appointed by the Supreme Leader.
You're getting to the point, Suzanne. You're absolutely right. So what you see, and this is one of the things that I always have to try and get across to people in Iran, that you see all these, quote, institutions, they mushroom out. They're all very exciting and they all look very sophisticated. But actually, it all comes down to a very simple equation. And that is basically the Supreme Leader is the person who directs it all. So if you look at the Parliament is also, at this stage, completely stuffed, full of people who've been vetted in, by the Guardian Council, full of hardliners, basically a lot of the leaders' nominees. So even those people who are going in, to the Guardian, at every stage, basically it's the Supreme Leader who has the ultimate say who sits in the Guardian Council. And the Guardian Council was not originally entrusted with the supervision of elections and all this sort of stuff, but it acquired these powers in the 1990s. And it's become more and more interventionary. And here's the crunch. If they decide that Suzanne Raine is no longer suitable to run in the election, they don't have to tell you why. Okay, so they just say you're no longer suitable. That could be anything. Could be that you're not Muslim enough, you're not loyal to the regime enough, you're not this, you're not that. But even more interesting is that they will often change their minds. So in one election, you will have been completely unsuitable. But in another election, as we might see now with Ali Larijani, one of the contenders who's thinking of running as a sort of a pragmatist, he might now suddenly be seen as eligible. Okay. So the key about this is that the Guardian Council makes it very clear who can run and who can't. They have a very tight supervision of the election itself. And they've already announced that if you're vetted out, there is no right of appeal. So don't mess around. Okay. So that's clear. So that's the first step. And then you get these candidates in. They register after 5 days. They then go for vetting by the Guardian Council. The Guardian Council will narrow it down to what they think is suitable. And the key question, the first stage for us is to say, is the regime feeling confident enough to actually have some sort of competition? Yeah. And in order to have some sort of competition, it needs to have a diverse set of candidates. So you're not going to get anyone from a reformist, by the way. Forget that. You might get Ali Larijani to try and pull out some of the more centrist, the centrist mums and dads in Tehran and others. But this is a big risk. This is a big risk, by the way, because these people may not turn out at all. Okay, you may allow this person to run it. But at the same time, for them, it's fine because it would show that he didn't get any votes and, they could definitively say he didn't get any votes. The last 3 elections, I think, certainly the last 2 elections, the presidential and the parliamentary election, were, I think, probably the worst in terms of what we might term a free and fair election in Iran. None of the elections in Iran are free and fair, by the way. There are those that are more free and more fair than others. And really, the ones that were more free and fair were really the ones that were held during the Khatami era. And the reason for that was, in a way, is because there was a diversity of control over the institutions. So who runs an election in Iran? It's the Ministry of Interior, the Guardian Council, and others. If the Ministry of Interior is in the control of one faction and the Guardian Council is a hardline faction, then obviously you get a little bit of friction between that, and that might allow things to run. Presently, the problem, as you've sort of highlighted quite well, is that all the major institutions of power are in the hands of a single faction. Okay? They're a hard line.
So we talked before a little bit about the Make Iran Great Again faction, which is...
the neo-principalists, as they're called. Okay? So they're the hardliners. They've called, one of the Iranian journalists has said, he's called them the neo-principalists. Principalists are Iranian fundamentalists. Okay, they're the hardliner, and these are the neo-principalists, if I see, as in neo-conservative, obviously.
So again, the revolution didn't fail because it was a bad idea. It failed because we didn't do it well enough. So we're going to do it more. And then, Ali, there's been a number of allusions to competition between people within the IRGC.
Yeah.
Basically competition around the future choice of supreme leader. Because you and I were discussing this the other day, that even if he's in the rudest of health, he's 85. So they all know that the timeline is shortening. And so they have to position themselves in order to be, that they're not going to end up with the wrong person in charge. That's what I think about. So how does that affect the dynamics that are coming through this election process that they weren't expecting to have?
So Khamenei, as you quite rightly said, is looking to the future. He's been looking to the future for some time, to be honest. I mean, he does have a longer term vision in this. So on the death of the supreme leader, there will be 3 institutional heads that will be important to manage the transition before we get to the election or the selection, let's say, of the new supreme leader. One of these will clearly be the president. The second one will be the head of the judiciary. And the third one is actually according to the constitution anyway, is going to be one of the religious lawyers from our Guardian Council. Now, within that, I think the Speaker of Parliament will still play a very important role. And most people assume the Speaker of Parliament will play an important role. But of course, the most important unofficial role will be played by the IRGC itself. So the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, will be the ones that will probably play the most important influence in the selection of the new leader. But of course, the constitutional role for that will be with the Assembly of Experts.
But the IRGC has no formal part of the process.
It has no formal part, but it's basically going to be kingmaker. I mean, in the sense that it is the armed wing of the revolution, so to speak. So that's going to be the most influential part. Now, we've also got to bear in mind, of course, that the Assembly of Experts itself is completely hollowed out as an institution.
Can I just, for our listeners, explain what it is? Because I think there's all these kind of the Council of Guardians, the Assembly of Experts, and it's almost mythological sounding somehow. So
it almost sounds effective. Yeah, but
the Assembly of Experts is, and I'm waiting for you to come back on this, directly elected by the public from a list of candidates vetted by the Guardian Council.
Yeah.
And it's made up of 88 clerics and has the responsibility for supervising imagine that doing his performance appraisal, supervising the supreme leader and electing a new one. And so the parliamentary elections on the 1st of March 2024, they also had then elections to the Assembly of Experts concurrently at that time. But as you would then say, I assume, since this is all supervised by the 12-man team of the Guardian Council, it's not really elections to the Assembly of Experts. But presumably then there are 88 people who are part of the Assembly of Experts body whose role it is in some way to supervise the process of nomination of the next supreme leader. And now you're going to tell me how that fits in with all the other power dynamics.
I mean, this is the other thing. So you need to bear in mind that the Assembly of Experts has no particular, I mean, it's meant to supervise as you say, the role and the work of the Supreme Leader. It doesn't do it. The election for the Assembly of Experts is every 8 years, and often it's without competition. Raisi got elected into the Assembly of Experts, I think, without anyone standing against him, because obviously the Guardian Council vetted everyone else out. So there you go. I mean, the whole thing is absurd, but it's got the aura of looking legitimate. Do you see what I mean? I mean, there's an election. And people would say to me, our Supreme Leader is indirectly elected because we have a director of the Assembly of Experts and then they elect the Supreme Leader. But in practice, that's not how it works. I mean, in practice, it's not. And what you've got is basically vested interests will come in to decide who on earth is going to succeed at the end of the day. And the key vested interest in many ways is Khamenei himself. So Khamenei himself had been organizing patiently to have the right people in all the key institutions, including in the Assembly of Experts, because had Raisi not died, he was being lined up to be the chair of the Assembly of Experts. So he would have had the president, chair of the Assembly of Experts, and then the two others who are in charge of the judiciary and the Speaker of the Parliament. And despite a lot of fractiousness in the Parliament, by the way, the previous Speaker has been re-elected Speaker, despite the fact that he doesn't really seem to have a sort of very popular base in the Parliament itself, but somehow they've organised it. So that would seem to suggest to me, by the way, that things are being pretty well managed for the same result. And I think all this puffing up of Raisi as a sort of I was going to say secular saint, obviously not a secular saint, as a saint, is also to say that what we need is someone who basically emulates him, who's a reflection of him at the end of the day. So there are people lining up to see if they can take that role. The most likely result is that Khamenei will want as similar a candidate to Raisi back in the presidency, and they will orchestrate it. And because, in the last two elections, I think they've said, the turnout was 40% or something, which was high, I think, by the way, for the last one. But nonetheless, let's take the official figures at face value for the time being. These are, by the Islamic Republic standards, pretty poor. But now they've decided that it's the new normal. So it's fine. So if we get 40% turnout in the next election, people will say, yeah, great, it's fine. And, some people will say, well, it shows how popular the regime is, or this or that or the other. The truth of the matter is 40% is fairly easy to pull out because obviously you've got civil servants and others who need to get things stamped in order to go and vote. I mean, they'll encourage a certain amount to vote. What will be interesting will be to see whether the vote in Tehran is higher than I think the 10% it was last time, which was really appallingly bad. So these are the mechanics of the process at work. And hopefully listeners will appreciate, as we've tried to outline, that there is a sort of an institutional structure, but it's been hollowed out, if I can put it that way. So it's not that these institutions have a sort of an independent authority. They don't. They're all basically paying lip service to the leader in one way or form.
Yeah, that's really clear. And then I interrupted you, Ali, and I'm very sorry, when you were explaining that there are then three people who matter in this. So who are they? Who are the three people?
So the three main institutional heads that will play a role in this transition. One will be whoever's president. So we're waiting to see whoever's going to be president. The second one is Mohsen Ejei, who's head of the judiciary. Then there's a very elderly gentleman by the name of Ayatollah Jannati, who's the secretary of the Guardian Council, who's the most likely person to be this sort of religious lawyer who's going to be basically the person who will have a say. And finally, of course, we've got to account for possibly this chap, Ghalibaf, the Speaker of Parliament, as also playing a role in that transition.
Why does the Speaker of Parliament have a role or not have a role?
Well, it's difficult. I mean, most people assume the Speaker of Parliament will have a role. But according to Article 111 of the Constitution, the Speaker of the Parliament doesn't specifically have a role. This is the thing. But most people will assume that he will, because whoever occupies that, whoever can manage the Parliament is going to be quite important. Although, in fairness, I mean, the Parliament has already been, all these institutions have been so hollowed out, it'd be very difficult for them to make a mess of it, although, all things are possible.
But is the Speaker of Parliament an IRGC man or a man?
Well, I mean, Ghalibaf at the moment comes, I think, from an IRGC background, but he was also in the law enforcement forces. So he's got what we call a security background. So he certainly, but, a lot of them basically are all very venal, if I can put it that way. I mean, they've got involved in the most extraordinary business affairs. So it's been a long time since really Ghalibaf Ghalibaf is most interesting in some ways for having at one stage said that he would be the new Reza Shah. He would be the new tough man to come in. And of course, that didn't go down very well with a number of people.
Right.
So those three people, they will sit in with the Assembly of Experts. So the Assembly of Experts, these are the sort of committee that will then, there's lots of committees in Iran. I mean, lots of committees, everyone consults. The Assembly of Experts is the ultimate body who will then, quote, vote, nominate for. Now, here, the Assembly of Experts, I just must say, in a traditional sense, what the Assembly of Experts, if we would understand it by constitutional, they vote for the next supreme leader. It's a very simple election, right? But actually, what they've increasingly been saying is that it's not our role to vote. Our role is to recognize who God has appointed. That's a slightly different function.
But I'm just thinking now, Ali, and I realize I should know more about it, but I'm not a Catholic. This doesn't seem completely different from the idea that the cardinals will assemble in...
Yeah. No. But except for the fact that there are... I mean, people have, and I've said it before, actually, that, the best analogy is a cardinals sort of council, and that's fine. But of course, the system here is, I mean, it's much more political in some ways and a much more, it's driven by a certain agenda. It would be a bit like, certainly in the current setup, if things turn out the way I've sort of outlined, what they're organizing for is for a hereditary succession to Khamenei.
Yeah.
So, obviously that's going to be quite distinctive. But, the analogies are there. I mean, the thing with the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is interesting and it's also quite frustrating, is that there are many what we would call similarities. There are many analogies you can draw, and they very deliberately structured. I mean, the constitution of the Islamic Republic is modeled on that of the French Fifth Republic when it was incepted. So they borrowed a lot of these things. But in practice, there's a lot of holes.
So let's go to the possible candidates themselves, recognizing that we're taking a risk here, Ali, because...
Yeah, because we don't really know who they are.
We don't know who they are. But there's a few that have been listed. So Saeed Jalili, who's a conservative politician.
So let's change the semantics a bit here, because I think this is another thing we do, and I think you're quite right. So the term of them being conservative, because the trouble is when we use the term conservative, we automatically think of, a conservative politician. Someone would sort of think they're a conservative politician.
Yes, sorry, that's just what I said. So obviously...
but you see, the point is the term conservative, do you know where the term conservative comes from? Term conservative actually originally was implemented by BBC Persian, interesting enough, and they adopted it as a term. Muhafaza-e-kar in Persian is basically conservative. The fact is the way they see themselves, they talk of themselves as principalists in usul-gara in Persian. Now, why do they take that meaning? Because, and here's the irony, in the 1990s and early noughties, people would talk about fundamentalists.
Yes.
Right? And so Iranians would take this word and they say, why are they calling us fundamentalists? And they said, well, because, you're a bit, one would try and explain to them. They said, does that mean we are fundamental to our principles? Yes, we are. We are. And they basically adopted that term, retranslated it back into the term principalist, and they see themselves as principalists. But the principalists are what we were talking about in terms of fundamentalists. And what you have now in Iran is several shades of principalist. And by the way, I think anyone who knows it's entirely legitimate to talk about conservatives, reformists, this, that, the other. It's fine. But the only reason I say we should maybe try and avoid that is because I'm acutely aware that people instinctively draw an analogy.
Yeah.
And I think we need to just be careful about that.
So let's say Saeed Jalili is a principalist politician. He was chief of nuclear negotiator under Ahmadinejad, for example. Yes. So he's principalist. What is the opposite of principalist? Because I can see that if you approach the Guardian Council and you say, I'd like to put myself forward as an unprincipled candidate, that's not going to work. Is there an equivalent of reformist?
Well, first of all, the reformists do describe as reformists. Islah Talab, we reform the system. And their function, their argument is that the state has to keep evolving and changing and relating to its, social base and so on and so forth. And this was
for everything
argument.
To stay the same, it's necessary for everything to change.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, not to draw these analogies, but, it's a very Whiggish argument, that basically we need to be progressive and forward-looking, whatever. And in order to protect our traditions, we need to reconcile tradition with modernity. And this current was very prominent in the 1990s, by the way, and obviously through the reform movement. And it was basically undermined and sabotaged and rooted out by these principalists, essentially directed by Ahmadinejad in the first instance. The only people who would be able to contend with the principalists at the moment are people who are basically regarded as pragmatists, okay? And they basically see themselves as, the terms they use now, if I remember correctly, are justice seeking, obviously, or servants of construction, which is basically a sort of a lip service to Rafsanjani's, centrist dad coalition type thing. In reality, I have to say, I don't think any of the people running as, quote, pragmatists or justice seekers are actually anything of the sort. For the simple point that you've actually made, nobody's going to get up and say, I'm not principled. So they all say, in one form or another, we all stick to our principles. And basically, their principles are very, very clearly defined by this loyalty to the supreme leader in a very absolute and uncompromising way, in a way that earlier politicians would not have done so, by the way. The earlier politicians say, our loyalties to the revolution, to the republic, to this, that, and the other. Now, it's to the person, the supreme leader, and the Valette Fari. So that's really the distinction. And I hesitate, because I'm just not very optimistic anymore when it comes to, but those, and I see them among colleagues and others who are sort of want to see the light at the end of the tunnel or whatever, and see the Islamic Republic as a functioning republic, by the way. And I don't, but would like to see that there will be a competitive election and they will allow someone to stand or whatever. And if they do, and if they're clever enough, by the way, to do it, this is where this sort of fungibility of resilience comes in, because they have allowed a degree of, flexibility in the system. My argument, nonetheless, is whatever flexibility they'll allow will not be enough. But nonetheless, it's better than nothing. It allows for a certain amount of fungibility. My guess is, given everything we've seen at the moment and everything we're looking at, is actually very little will change. And if someone like Jalili comes in, Jalili is the Puritan's Puritan. He wears a hair shirt, he makes a virtue really out of his sanctimonious piety. And fine, on one level, good luck to him. On the other hand, his views are extremely radical. I mean, in some ways, they're much, much more ideological than Raisi ever was. Raisi is a technocrat. He basically did as he was told. Jalili is a believer. I mean, in a very deep sense.
But hang on, he's not a cleric. Is he a cleric?
No. But
so this is fascinating.
Yeah, this is the other thing that you need. And in the piece that I'm going to send you, actually, most of the Orthodox clerics in the Islamic Republic of Iran detest this sort of stuff. They don't believe in the superstition. They think Islam works against superstition. They see themselves as very much part of a rational discourse, okay? The person who brought all this mumbo-jumbo in was Ahmadinejad, not a cleric, okay? And Khamenei has endorsed and supported it because, in my view, it supports his own agenda, which is that if you're going to indulge in a charismatic succession in which you're going to hand power over to your son for no other reason, really, than it is a charismatic succession, i.e. I am the Lord's anointed, then you have to encourage this level of superstition and belief in this stuff. In a republic, as we would understand it, you could justify it on raw power, but you couldn't justify it on, that there's some mystical connection between the leader and God. I mean, that you need a group of people who are willing to believe in that. And that's where I think that all comes from. But it's very interesting. And I think people need to realize this, that the paradox in the Islamic Republic of Iran is a lot of people on the clerical orthodoxy. For instance, we were talking recently about Sistani. Sistani doesn't believe in this sort of stuff.
Just to be clear for our listeners, Ayatollah Sistani, who is 93.
Can't remember how, but he's sitting in Iraq. Yeah.
Is sitting in Iraq and is actually the supreme point of reference.
He is by far considered the supreme point of learning and scholarship for most Shias, but he's a quietist. He doesn't believe in getting involved in politics. So Khamenei also, because he's managed to spread his patronage network so widely, is in a much, much stronger position.
So, Ali, you've just accidentally introduced Mojtaba Khamenei, who is the son of Ali Khamenei. And what you're suggesting is that the plan is that he would take over. So I just wonder whether we could say a little bit more about him, because I noticed that he's just a tiny bit older than me, which makes him the perfect age to assume power.
Well, quite.
And I mean, he is a cleric. What do people say about him? He was affiliated with Ahmadinejad, wasn't he?
And Mojtaba basically came to prominence in 2005 when Ahmadinejad won the presidency. And a lot of people, including some of the defeated candidates, accused Mojtaba of having rigged the election in support of Ahmadinejad.
Yeah.
He then really comes into prominence in the 2009 Green Movement, where he's basically seen as the person who's the driving force behind the repression. Now, whether that's true or not, we don't know, but that's generally the belief.
Because he was supposed to have run the Basij, which is the paramilitary militia who beat up all the demonstrators and everything. Yeah.
So, I mean, in one sense, when you talk to Iranians and they say, how on earth can Mujtaba succeed his father? They almost all say, well, he's been running the country for the last 20 years anyway, so he knows what he's doing. I mean, that's a slightly flippant answer, but certainly he's been at the heart of, quote, government. And he's also been at the heart of the repressive apparatus. Now, more importantly, there are a number of other factors that I think need to be borne in. One is the charisma around Khamenei himself as he's tried to build it, concocted as it may be, but nonetheless, as the Ali of the age, he's presenting himself as this sort of equivalent of the first of the Shia imams. Shiism, of course, in the imamate is hereditary. Yeah. So there's that element of it. And you can see that in terms of the propaganda that the regime has put out. Mujtaba himself, despite his youthfulness, as you pointed out, is suddenly
his extreme youth.
Has suddenly, we've discovered, become an Ayatollah. He's dealing in the most sophisticated philosophical discussions and lessons. He's regarded as extremely bright, innate knowledge, if you will. So that's all being set up on that side. So, you've got the Shiism, which is hereditary. You've got Mujtaba being touted as this great learned and wise Ayatollah, despite his age. He's got political experience as well. And this is the crucial one, he appears to be the favored candidate of the IRGC or key elements within the IRGC. So that, I think, is what tips everything in Mujtaba's favor, quite apart from the fact that his father clearly is pushing for it.
But is he a cleric? I mean, I see that he teaches in Qom. Yeah. So he's at least some kind of formal.
No, they call him an Ayatollah.
Role as a cleric. So he's a proper Ayatollah.
Well, I mean, steady on, but yeah, I mean that's how they publicly. I mean, I think Ayatollahs in Iran these days, you get it by examination almost. By it never used to be this way, and you can become an Ayatollah very young.
Okay, so this is fascinating because what you have there is a group of people. If Saeed Jalili is being named, he's associated with Ahmadinejad, so is Mujtaba. Who knows what's going to happen over the next couple of weeks? But I'm starting to understand a little bit better, thank you to you, Ali, some of the characters here, because I think this is the difficulty when you're just watching it. You can't really understand. So the other character, briefly, if you may, is the son of former President Rafsanjani. So Mohsen Hashemi Rafsanjani is also being said to be a possible candidate.
Yeah, I'm not sure he'll be allowed to run.
Okay, because he's a principled moderate.
Well, because of his association with the Rafsanjani family. So Mohsen Hashemi is the eldest son of Rafsanjani, and he's had some experience in politics. He tried to run for mayor of Tehran at some stage. He's got a bit of inside knowledge of the politics. I think it's unlikely that they'll let him run, however, precisely because of his family connections and precisely because he's his father's son. Rafsanjani, I mean, there's a relentless attack on the Rafsanjani family for corruption, which is not unjustified, it has to be said. But the fact is that it's quite clear that the regime, or the deep state, if you want to call it that, Khamenei and his acolytes, would certainly not be keen on Mohsen Hashemi winning. And I think they would only let him run if they were pretty sure he was going to dive. He was not going to win at all. So, I mean, it would be interesting to see if he gets through the vetting. But my feeling at the moment is he won't.
Ali, this has been totally fascinating and really helpful, because if we're going to watch and understand what happens in the run-up to the 28th of June, understanding how the processes work or don't work, and your sort of obvious, in retrospect, insight that there aren't political parties, so this is all about individuals standing. Although, sorry, because now I realise I do want to ask you, if individuals have to stand...
Yeah.
They have to develop their own followerships, don't they?
So you have these networks and you have these groupings. I mean, the best way to talk about different factions. The trouble is people can stand often representing different factions. So when I say there's no political way, it's a bit like saying that you were having a list for a particular election, and such a candidate for this constituency will be standing for the Greens, the Conservative Party and Labour. I mean, that's the way they do it. So you'll see that. So in one election, for instance, I remember a few years ago, there was an election, I think it might have been for the Assembly of Experts, actually, I can't remember now. Someone came and played it very well. I mean, this is the smoke and mirrors that I hope listeners will really appreciate. They came out and they said, the moderate faction has won a number of seats in the Assembly of Experts. And then when we looked at the list, we realized that a number of these people who'd signed up for the moderate faction were also actually members of the Principalists. I mean, so I said, Well, hang on a minute. I mean, that's not actually true. They're basically part of both factions. So it depends on how you want to read it. And that's what I mean. There's no strict political party. It's not like a political party in a sense that supports a candidacy. They're thoroughly dependent, yes, on a certain amount of funding and financial backing for various groups and factions, but they're not formal parties. There's no transparency in this. And this is, I'm sorry to say, what makes it so difficult for us to really fully comprehend the different networks at work. But, they clearly are there, but they're very closed fraternities of individuals, some of which cross over into various. But it's an elite game, by the way. It's a very elite game. Most Iranians are not involved in this at all. I mean, it's got nothing to do with the vast majority.
Okay, so I mean, now I'm thinking of the West Wing, and I'm thinking that if you want to stand, do you have to promise people things, or are you in a position to promise people things? And I'm assuming you're going to say, no, you're not, because whether somebody then ends up getting a position, even if you're president, you're not all powerful. You're not in a position to grant the things you might have promised.
That's absolutely true. It's limited on what you can promise, but you are in a position where you are, basically as a faction, you have access to a particular institutional base, organizational base, I should say, in which you can distribute, you have a certain control over what you can distribute in terms of patronage. Ahmadinejad did it. I mean, Ahmadinejad did it quite well. He distributed contracts, for instance. Who gets the contracts for various things? The president could. It's very junta-like, South American junta. So there is an element of that there. But you are quite right, and I think this is the important thing. And people must realize the presidency is not the most powerful position in the country. The most powerful position is the supreme leader, and that's what we really need to keep our eyes on.
Brilliant. We're going to stop there, Ali. Thank you very much indeed. No, I mean, I'm really, that was really helpful, and a whole load of things which I simply didn't know, and now I do.
I mean, I hope you see, I know I'm getting across just how smoke and mirrors it all is, and I sit with people and they say, oh, this body then negotiates with that body and then it's this body and it's all very complex, whatever. And I basically say, so who has the final decision on all this? I mean, who gets it? And they say, oh, it's the supreme leader. I said, well, I mean, it's not, what you're basically saying is all these organizations were set up with, I think, a genuine intent for it to be a functional republic. But basically, they've gutted it. And, as I say to people, there's no shortage of decent people in Iran, actually, who know how to run an economy, but they're basically either in prison, dead, or abroad.
Okay, we're stopping now, though, Ali, because we've run out of time. So let's just say thank you, Ali.
Thank you. There's so much more to do, but there you are.
Well, I'm afraid we are going to have to come back in a couple of weeks once it's clear who's running and talk more about this. We'll choose our timing, just like the Supreme Leader will choose his timing.
Thank you very much, Suzanne.
Goodbye.